It's November. The government's fucking shut down. Longest government shutdown ever. So you think that working with the Department of War is hard. Now add Congress, right? I remember when I first started at the DOD. It was the DOD back then. Get your messaging right. When I first started at the DOD, now the Department of War, you have to go through like this like onboard in briefing. And, you know, you got to, well, I'm new here at the department, and what do you do? Where do you come from? And it's just kind of like onboarding for new employees at the DOD. And while I was there, the woman who was running it, you know, we're going around the room, and I had just come off Capitol Hill, and she was like, oh my God. She's like, we need to talk after this. And so she had been on the Hill. She had been a professional staff member. Also, sidebar, we should probably talk about the roles of people in Congress, right? When we talk about members, like there are members of Congress and they're super important. Don't get me wrong. But like, there's also like professional staff members that are like super experts in everything that they do so that they can craft the bills and advise the members of Congress. And then there are people who work in their office, which are different, and they have different roles and responsibilities. We should probably do a breakout on just like the roles and responsibilities of people who work in Congress. Because if you're going to be engaging there, you need to know who's who in the zoo, because they're different and they do different things. And you have to talk to everybody, but you have to know why you're talking to people. So anyways, parking lot, that one. So I'm checking into the DOD as a new employee in the Undersecretary of Defense for Policy. And the woman who's running it, who's awesome, she's like, hey, we need to talk afterwards. And she was saying, she's like, look, I want to put together a training course on how to work with Congress, because people who work at the department don't understand how much they work for Congress, right? A person who works at the Department of Defense is spending a significant amount of time. Like I don't want to like over or underestimate this. Like there is a good portion of your day where you're working for Congress or working at the direction of Congress as a Department of anything employee. That comes in the shape of congressional reporting requirements, congressional briefs, congressional visits on the Hill. Like members of Congress taking briefs all day on the Hill. And every one of those meetings, if they're with government officials, has taken days, if not weeks, to prepare, to walk them up for that. You're doing prep briefs, you're doing read ahead packages, you're doing congressional reports that have to go through like 20 layers of scrutiny before you're going to release something from a department to Congress. It's nuts how much someone who works in a government executive branch agency, a federal executive branch agency, actually works for Congress, like does work for Congress as directed. It's nuts. You thought working with any federal department and doing government contracting and like doing a startup and like, oh, I'm going to do defense tech, war tech is like hard because of the Department of War. No, Congress too, right? So longest government shutdown in history. So here we are. Why is the government shut down? We're going to argue that until the cows come home. I don't know if you say things like that. There's a very good chance that it's over like within this week, because spoiler alert, there are massive elections today. If it's not over by the end of the week because the elections have panned out and everyone on their side has got what they thought they were going to get out of a government shutdown, it will probably reopen when SNAP runs out, because if you don't have food stamp program for like 41 million Americans, it's a huge problem. And we're going into a federal election year, which starts on January 1st of 2026. So yeah, government shutdown. It's terrible. It's awful. It's the longest one ever. May end this week after the elections in states, the off-cycle state level elections, or when food stamps run out. That's my guess. All right. So longest government shutdown. What does this actually mean for you all? If you've got anything in progress right now, if you've got an award that if you're in an award process that you're waiting to award, that's not going to happen until at least we reopen the government and you get a continuing resolution, short-term funding bill until all 12 appropriations get passed into law. So if you're waiting on something to award, that's not happening during a shutdown. If you're waiting on payment for something, very likely you're going to have delays on that. The contractors and the federal contracting professionals are all likely furloughed right now. It's very hard to write a contract right now. So if you've got something in contracting or you're waiting on payment, that's probably going to be delayed until at least a CR is passed. And then in the CR, you're going to see a lot of workarounds because the current continuing resolution that was passed in the House, that is awaiting passage in the Senate, i.e. the cause of the shutdown that the Congress couldn't pass a continuing resolution when appropriations expired on October 1st. That bill was only written to go to the 21st of November. And I'm going to put a paycheck on they're not going to come back out of a government shutdown and pass all 12 appropriations bills in less than 20 days. So now we're going to have to reopen the government on a CR that goes until November 21st and then immediately pass another one that probably goes to the end of the year. So the workarounds that you're going to be seeing and you're probably going to need to be talking about with any kind of contracting officers or program offices, program managers, they're going to be workarounds specifically using reconciliation funds where they can, because that's executable right now and is not bound to a fiscal year. They have their own length of funding determined through the reconciliation bill, one big, beautiful bill, but they're not bound by utilization inside a fiscal year, which means we don't need to wait for a fiscal year 26 appropriations bill to spend reconciliation. So you're likely going to see a lot of workarounds that they're using other transaction authorities and reconciliation to get the work done until we get all 12 appropriations bills passed. That's just my speculation. But if you're in process of doing anything, which doesn't help people who are like trying to get awards and contracts. But if you've got something in process, it's probably the avenue that you should be discussing with your government sponsors. That's just the state of play. Everything's going to be slowed down until we can basically, unfuck what's going on here. So some interesting signals out of the White House on the international front. So I'm always bullish on founders, companies, startups working internationally when and where you can. And there's the reason that I'm so bullish on that is depending on the company, they don't have this terrible process that we have, right? So for instance, SOCOM, Special Operations Command, runs an international special operations range day out at the Nevada Test and Training Center. So like middle of nowhere, Nevada, you go shoot guns, blow shit up. It's fucking awesome. Everybody should go. Everybody should sign up. I believe applications are live right now for this year, pending resolutions, appropriations, the things and the stuff. But I think the applications are open out, but like they bring all of the international special operations forces together to try out new stuff, right? To meet American companies and all the things they do. So, you think about U.S. Special Operations Command, roughly about 75,000 total people, about 40 to 50,000 of those, depending on current numbers, are like the actual people you think about, like the Green Berets and the Marine Raiders and the Navy SEALs that actually do the thing. If you look at that in other international kind of NATO countries, say, I don't know, Finland or Norway or Poland, the entirety of their special operations forces are like a couple thousand people. You can get in front of an international buyer and you have something that's cool and it's not ITAR controlled, they might just swipe a credit card and buy 1,000 of them right there. They don't need this huge, like ridiculous bureaucratic process where they're buying, reams of paper like an aircraft carrier. They don't need to do that. They can just swipe their card. So I'm always very bullish on international sales when and where applicable. It's a really great way to get money, to get revenue coming in the door. You get use cases. You can build case studies around that, government to government endorsements, support, letters of performance or what do they call it? Like reviews, like basically like a government to government Yelp review is the best thing that you can get, because then they know that they're not trying to sell you on it. Coming from the commercial sector, you're always seen to a certain degree as a salesman. If another government, even if it's international, says, hey, we really like using this and it's American company, you should consider that. It actually goes a really long way. So in the world of international, coming out of the White House on October 20th, there was a series of statements that reaffirmed support to AUKUS. So AUKUS, Australia, UK, and U.S. partnership, specifically around maritime shipbuilding in the submarine program. The idea right off the bat was to have submarines go, nuclear submarines going to Australia and the UK to support joint and international operations in the Indo-Pacific Command, Indo-PACOM, because they just don't make those kinds of things. The United States is the only one in that group that actually makes those things. So we wanted to start training our partners on it. Now, it's had fits and starts and bumps in the road, and there's all kinds of reasons it's not as, successful or it hasn't gotten as far as everybody would have liked it to. But the White House reaffirming support and saying, hey, this is something that we started under the first administration and we want to keep it going, is a very good sign, regardless whether you're in the submarine base or not, because those are obviously key international partners that if you have any bandwidth at all to be thinking internationally, those are probably the best places to start. I would say, to a certain degree, right, wrong, or indifferent, I'm not going to make a value call on or a tactical call on what the future of Ukraine looks like, but I'll tell you, I would probably be investing time, energy, and resources in developing relationships in UK and Australia. And I feel like you might be skating behind the puck a little bit if Ukraine is your focus. Indo-Pacific, still very important. UK, Australia, and to a lesser but probably important degree, countries in the Middle East, in the CENTCOM, Central Command, AOR, because that place is just never going to be okay, right? There's always going to be urgent needs and urgent requirements coming out of CENTCOM. I think that's just the norm for the foreseeable future, regardless of whether the war in Israel and Gaza peace treaty actually holds or not. If you're in or around the maritime base at all, UK and Australia, 100%. Even if you're a sub-tier supplier, even if you have something that goes into the maritime industrial base at all, right? So Anduril just landed a huge contract for their autonomous submarine, the UUV, the unmanned undersea vessel Ghost Shark, with Australia to the point where they're building manufacturing there. I think it was like $1 billion deal, right? These are the things, if you're in maritime specifically or maritime adjacent, you should be looking at. Additionally, there's always been this thought that AUKUS, being Indo-PACOM focused, would expand very naturally also to South Korea and Japan. So on the 29th, not policy, not executive order, not in any kind of actual directives, but if we know anything about President Trump, he will speak off the cuff. He will say what he means, what he thinks, and those are actually really great signals. They're very early signals. They're early indicators. I wouldn't go, betting the farm on what he says passingly in a conference, but his administration is pretty consistent about executing his direction. So on the 29th of October, President Trump made a claim that the U.S. would share nuclear submarine technology with South Korea. Now, is that actually going to happen? No, it's held up in yes, I'm not saying it's not. Is it happening right now? Is that an automatic switch you could turn on? Absolutely not. There's Nuclear Atomic Energy Export Act and nuclear controls and IAEA stuff. There's a lot that goes into it. But that's a great signal that the president is putting out there, that a great partner like South Korea would be considered for something as important as nuclear submarine information. They produce a lot of ships in South Korea as well as Japan. It's a natural expansion of the kind of allied, I wouldn't call South Korea and Japan Western, but the we don't like China crew of allies and partners in the maritime space. The natural expansion into South Korea and Japan makes a lot of sense, and this is a great signal. So again, if you're thinking about working with international partners, Australia and the UK, obviously, because we already have formed up AUKUS activities and plans and pillars, South Korea and Japan, I think, come as a third and fourth on that priority if you're looking for long-term international relationships and investment, because the threat of the CCP and the CCP's desire to dominate the world isn't going away anytime soon, which is why we all get up in the morning. So Republic of Korea, South Korea, really great signals there if you're thinking international. All right. Moving on to Congress. We covered it a little bit. Congress has failed to pass 12 appropriations bills, as they mostly do every year for a majority of the last 20, if not 30 years. 12 appropriations bills have to be passed by midnight on September 30th, or the government shuts down. If you want to keep it going, but you haven't done your homework, i.e. pass all the appropriations bills, you pass a continuing resolution. They failed to do that as well, so we are in a government shutdown. So before we get into the appropriations bills and why we're shut down, I think it's important to note that one piece of legislation seems to be moving faster towards full enactment that's also important to this community, which is the National Defense Authorization Act. So the National Defense Authorization Act has passed the House and it's passed the Senate. So back to how a bill becomes a law, right? Schoolhouse rock. Each chamber, we have two chambers. We have a bicameral legislature. We have a House and a Senate. Each chamber, the House and the Senate, pass their own version of a bill through their subcommittees, their committees, and then off the floor as a chamber. And then they go into a process called conference, where they take the two bills and they have to argue it out and make both bills exactly the same, come to agreements, then take them back to their chamber, pass them as conferenced to then go to the president for signature. So right now in that process, both chambers have passed their own individual bill, and now we're waiting on conference. So no surprise that even when the government is shut down, people in the government have to work, right? It just means they're not getting paid. They're cut down to essential services. Well, for the most part, and in my experience, everyone in Congress is deemed essential because they're the ones who have to pass the bills to get the government reopened. So mostly everybody is essential. That's office by office. I've said it once, I've said it a million times. Congress is 535 small businesses, and they can run their individual offices however the hell they want. They could send everybody home and say, you're not getting paid. I'll call you when the government opens back up. That's usually not the case. People are back at the office right now in Congress working. Some of that work is the pre-conference activities for bills like the NDAA. Now, conference is a formal event. All the members get in these big conference rooms, these committee rooms, and they actually argue out the things that the staff hasn't been able to resolve at their level. So the staff, the professional staff members at this point, are working with their colleagues, both Democrat and Republican, depending on where they're at, and their colleagues in the House and the Senate, respectively, depending on where they sit, to figure out what these final bills look like. That is going on right now. Why this is important to you, other than holy gee whiz, that's cool, something's happening, is in the NDAA, we have words. Sorry, I didn't break there. In the NDAA, we have words. Article 1, Section 8 of the Constitution states, Congress has the constitutional responsibility to govern the rules of land and naval forces. What does that mean? Congress tells the military what to do. So a lot of the really great things that we're seeing this year that are going to be great for the startup ecosystem are in the NDAA, in the sections that were included from the Speed and the Forged Act. This is a lot of the defense reform stuff, the acquisition reform stuff. This is the policies that are being enacted in law of move faster, move the tools that we've given you, learn how to use other transaction authorities, maximize flexible budgets and programs to move faster to get the things where the warfighters need them as fast as possible. A lot of the old style, you got to keep this in mind. The current acquisition budget and contracting process that's in place today stems from the National Security Act 1947 after World War II, when the Department of War changed into the Department of Defense, and then subsequently in the 1960s when a guy named Robert McNamara was the Secretary of Defense, who came from private sector, who was a very industrial manufacturing person. And at the time, he set the department up to look like the shop floor at General Motors. Processes, dependencies, systems, well, that just doesn't work with the speed of war and conflict anymore, because at that time, militaries and governments made military and government technology. You didn't have a vibrant commercial industry making fucking bombs and shit. You also didn't have a prevalence of cheap technologies all over the world that enable non-state actors or even state actors to leverage non-government sources for warfighting capabilities like what we're seeing in Ukraine, right? The weaponization of commercial drones really paints a picture that a manufacturing industrial based style process just isn't going to keep up with this. So all of that is contained in the House and the Senate NDAA. And now the staff are basically figuring out, negotiating, fighting, however it's working out inside closed doors, what of those two bills are going to get across the finish line. So this is a place where if you go into those bills, you look them up on congress.gov and look for the current version of the NDAA in the House and the Senate. There's a little tracker on there on congress.gov. It's actually very helpful. It's a little ticker, and it'll show you where it is in the process. It'll say it's been introduced, it's passed committee, it's passed the House, it's passed the chamber, right? And so you find the House and the Senate version on congress.gov and then read through them and find all the parts that you like and find all the parts that you don't like. And this is where you can get active and you can start making those phone calls. You can call your member of Congress. You can call your industry organization. If you're part of SVDG, if you're part of an AUVSI, a Defense Entrepreneurs Forum, fill in the blank, right? If you're part of any of these organizations, you're like, hey, this part of the bill I really like. What are we doing to make sure that this stays in there? And then you have advocacy at different levels. If anybody hires a lobbyist, this is where they get involved. And you go and say, hey, I really like this part of the bill. Make sure that this stays in there. And that's, that's your way of getting involved, right? The First Amendment of the Constitution says a lot of things, and everybody knows, the free speech and freedom of religion part, but it also says something to the effect of, and it's obviously in Old English, and I'm probably going to get this wrong, but you have the right to redress Congress for the petition of you have the right to petition Congress for the redress of grievances. What in the shit does that mean? That means you get to complain to Congress. You have a constitutionally protected right to complain to Congress. They are your representatives. They should be listening to you and to a degree doing the things that their constituencies need. So under your First Amendment protections to petition Congress for the redress of grievances, you get to complain to Congress, whether you do that yourself, you do that through an advocacy group, or whether you hire a lobbyist to do that. When you see things in the NDA that you like, you go tell Congress about it. When you see things in the bills that you don't like, go tell Congress about it. So NDA, mostly important for the words and the things that are going to become the direction to the Department of War on how they're going to conduct their activities, how they're going to execute as the executive branch, how they're going to function for the following year and all years in perpetuity. As long as things are passed into legislation, they become Title 10, U.S. Code. They exist in perpetuity until they are overturned, as opposed to appropriations bills that their legislative authority is contained within that fiscal year for which the appropriations bill is passed. So if you like things in there, tell someone. If you don't like things in there, tell someone. But the moral of the story is the bill's in pre-conference activity at a staff level right now, and we should see that before the end of the calendar year. So the DoD will either have authorities and processes and procedures that they've already implemented, codified in law, or they will be given new tools to do things better and faster on behalf of the warfighter, for which we all work. Okay, moving on. Appropriations. In an average cycle of Congress, a 2-year cycle of Congress, something to the tune of like 20,000 bills are introduced. Any member can introduce a piece of legislation almost any day of the week, and it could be the most ridiculous shit on the planet. It will never see the light of day. They will only get their signature on it because not a other sane person in the world would sign on to it. That shit happens all the time. That's how members of Congress go back to their constituents and say, I'm fighting for you. I introduced a piece of legislation that said all the money in the federal government's going to come to our district, and yay, vote for me. And it's never going to go anywhere. About 20,000 pieces of legislation are introduced every 2-year cycle of Congress. Of those that actually get passed into law is like less than 1%, like 200 bills or less get passed in a session of Congress. Of those, something to the number of like half of them, I haven't run the numbers lately, but something to the number of half of them are like naming post offices, federal buildings, and mountaintops after people. Like these are not like substantive, life-changing, country-changing pieces of legislation. The 12 that matter are the appropriations bills, because if we don't have those, we are in shutdown. Welcome to today. Okay, so the House passed their version of the fiscal year 2026 defense appropriations bill. Okay, so back to congress.gov. If you pull the bill, fiscal year 26, right, because it's already supposed to have been passed, we are 1 month and 4 days into the fiscal year of October 2026. I'm sorry. We are 1 month and 4 days into the fiscal year of 2026. We're still trying to pass the bill for this year, but you go on congress.gov and you can see the bill. You can see what's in there. The Senate also passed their corresponding appropriations bill for defense out of their committee, though it failed to pass the full chamber back in October. So what does that mean? So that means the Appropriations Committee, they're on board with what's in the bill, at least to a point where it could pass out of the committee. So your subcommittees have, I don't know, call it 10, 15 members on it. Your full committees have 20, 30 members on it. The House has 3-4 times as many members because they're 3 or 4 times as large. Senate's got 100 members. The House has 435, and then a handful of delegates that are non-voting delegates from DC, Puerto Rico, Guam, right? But subcommittee small, full committee larger, full chamber, all your 100 members or 435 members respectively. So it failed to pass the full Senate, and it failed. It's nuanced. It doesn't matter, but it failed to pass cloture, which in the Senate is a ridiculous rule that says we have to vote to stop discussing the bill so that we can vote. So essentially, cloture means we're going to vote, and it failed to even get that far. So we know what's in a Senate bill, and we know what's in a House bill for defense appropriations. Again, this is real money. Article 1, Section 9 of the Constitution says no funds will be drawn from the Treasury without the appropriation of Congress. Appropriations Committee. These are the individuals who write the bill and then pass them in their respective chambers that fund the Department of War and the intelligence community and certain aspects of the nuclear enterprise, some State Department funding, some Homeland funding, and then other weird shit. I think there's even there's a small portion there for FAA funding. Most of the funding sits in all of the appropriate bills that you would expect for those things: state and foreign ops, homeland approps, wherever FAA sits, CJS maybe. But there are sprinkles of things that get funded through the defense appropriations bill they're inherently there for defense. All in all together, put that all together, and you call that the 050. It's the entire national security bill, which you can look up. It's on OMB's website, and it'll show you how we spend in everything, because there's also a national security thread in every one of those bills as well. So you see a preponderance of the defense spending is focused specifically on the Department of War and the intelligence community, with some other stuff. The moral of that story, most importantly, is you can see what's in there. Again, read the bill. Go in there. See where there's money for things that you do. Tell someone. Carry your ass up to the hill. Knock on your member of Congress's door. Hey, talk to your advocacy groups. Get a fucking lobbyist if you want one. I'm not saying to, but I'm saying, like, you could also represent yourself in court. It's probably not a good idea. You should probably get a lawyer. If you're really going to get into this, you should probably have someone on your team who knows what the hell they're talking about. If you've even made it this far in this episode and you've never seen my crazy ass before, this is complicated shit. I wouldn't represent myself in court. I would probably get an expert if I really want to get serious about influencing, how the government works. Either way, if you like what's in there, tell someone. I think the moral of the story here is read the bills. Read the NDAA in its entirety from both chambers before it gets passed. Read the appropriations bill for defense before it gets passed from both chambers in its entirety. See where you agree or disagree with Congress, and then go tell someone. Okay. Also, in the appropriations bill, you will see direction that kind of feels like what you would see in the NDAA. Now, this is usually in the general provisions and what is called front matter, things that you will see at the front of the bill, and then things that you will see at the back of the bill. These are directives on how you can spend the money, right? So typically it's confined to the funding line, which could be found in the Department of War's comptroller website, and you can open up the president's budget request into the J books, the justification books, and you can find all these, and you have budget line item numbers and explanations for programs. And when the Congress puts money into the bill, the Appropriations Committee puts money into the bill, they're putting those into those line items, and they're saying you can spend this much money on this thing. Sometimes they're narrow and sometimes they're broader, but that's how they have to spend the money. And if they want to move the money out of those places that Congress appropriated it, they have to do one of two things. If it's below 15 million, they can move it, and then they just have to kind of notify Congress after they do it, say, hey, by the way, I moved this stuff. If it's more than 15 million, they have to do what's called a reprogramming action, and they actually have to send a written request to Congress and say, please, can I move this? It's above the $15 million threshold, and they have to approve that moving. There are other ways that Congress controls the spending of the money, and that comes through some front matter and then through general provisions. It looks like NDAA, but it is typically tied directly to how to spend the money, and it's only effective for the year of that appropriation. So in past, you've seen, the Congress, when they're mad at the Department of War or Defense, whatever it was at the time, you'll see provisions in there that, until this report is delivered, we're going to reduce the Secretary of Defense's salary to $1. You see shit like that, right? But then there are other things in there that you should pay attention to. Some are funding authorities or flexibilities or ways that you can spend money. So it's important to also understand if there are any provisions, prohibitions, or direction on how certain monies are going to be spent. When you go to engage with the Department of War, the military service, whoever your customer is, it's important to know that they're going to have an array of restrictions on how they can spend certain money. Right? And the way this is probably all going to get across the finish line is while the House has, over the last few years, demanded 12 appropriations bills to be passed in isolation so that they can discuss, debate, argue about each appropriation in focus, right? We should argue about defense appropriations when we're discussing what's important for the national security of our nation. Health and Human Services probably shouldn't be negotiated at the same time, because then you see what you're doing here and you're playing mommy versus daddy, and you're saying, okay, well, you can have more nuclear weapons, but we're going to need more food stamp program, right? And it's a way to get business done in DC, but it's a losing game on both ends. And the Republican-led Congress the Republican-led House over the last few years has moved in the direction of doing 12 appropriations bills where they do one issue at a time. Now, that's not going to be how they get passed at the end of the day. They're going to bundle these together. They're going to bring them over to the Senate to use those functions of saying you can have more nuclear weapons, but we want more food stamps. And that's the way the negotiations actually happen and get across the finish line here in DC. So you're going to see packaged bills. They go by all kinds of stupid names: omnibus, minibus, cromnibus. I don't know. We're going to start seeing those once the government opens up, and as they package these things together to basically try to get the bills across the finish line so we don't end up in another year-long continuing resolution. So watch out for those. Staying on Congress, but moving into a committee of jurisdiction that has become increasingly important that we normally don't talk about. So there are appropriations committees, the 12 of them that pay the bills for the government. And then there's basically everyone else. Every other committee is roughly or generally referred to as an authorizing committee. They authorize the executive branch to do certain things. Now, State Department, Homeland hasn't been reauthorized or gets reauthorized if it has been like every 20 years. FAA gets reauthorized typically on a clip of about every 5 years. The NDAA has reauthorized or controlled the activities. When we say authorized, that's all we really mean is controlling the activities of the Department of Defense and War consistently for, I think, 60 plus years in a row. Okay. Another authorizing committee that usually isn't in focus that is highly important right now for the startup community is the Small Business Committee. So Small Business Committee is the committee that governs the activities of the Small Business Administration. They have oversight of the programs at SBA, and they direct SBA how to do certain things. An SBA program that has become increasingly important over the years for defense, technology, and very specifically this renaissance of startups in, national security, defense, war, tech, whatever we're calling it today, has been the Small Business Innovation Research Grant Program, SBIR and STTR. As we speak today, that program is dead. Usually I can talk to a startup at any stage and they have some kind of engagement with this program, whether it's an SBIR phase 1, which is basically some version of a book report, technical feasibility study to the tunes of, high hundreds of thousands of dollars, right? $600,000, $800,000, all the way up to a SBIR phase 2, SBIR phase 2, where you're going to get somewhere in the $1 million-ish to actually create the prototype. There's a tangible deliverable out of this. And then the expansion of that program into TACFI and StratFi, very specifically in the Air Force, tactical financing and strategic financing, where you can bring other government money and access additional SBIR dollars, or you can bring in private capital. So now you're doing a raise, you've closed a raise, you're going to use some of that private capital to add directly to the program, which helps accelerate your what was a $1.5 million research, development, testing, and engineering, RDT&E, research, development, testing, and engineering, which also includes experimentation. You can grow that pot to supercharge these prototypes that you started. I don't think that's new information. If you're watching this, I'm going to guess that's not new information about what the SBIR program is. Let's get into where it is today. So it is dead as of today, like dead as a doornail, has not been reauthorized. Why does that matter? Because even appropriating the defense bill does not restart SBIR. SBIR is an SBA program that is authorized by the Small Business Administration for use in government agencies. And many government agencies can use SBIR. Actually, the second largest user of SBIR behind the Department of War is the National Institute of Health, NIH. Lots of SBIR grants there. Problem: SBIR is an authority to conduct those activities within the executive branch. The funding for SBIR in the Department of War actually comes from a 3% tax on the total RDT&E budget that is appropriated, which means even if you appropriate the entire fiscal year 26 bill with all of the RDT&E as it stands today, you do not have the authority to tax the Department of Defense to conduct SBIR activities. So SBIR needs to be reauthorized in either the Small Business Committee, which is where it has been traditionally reauthorized because it's a small business administration function, or it could be reauthorized in the National Defense Authorization Act. Here's the problem. In the Senate, we are at an impasse. Senator Joni Ernst introduced what is called the Innovate Act. It is basically a laundry list of things that she and the Republican side of the Small Business Committee, inside the committee, the small group that we were talking about, want to see reformed before reauthorization. This includes mostly two issues. One, the fact that a large amount of SBIR dollars go to companies that have made a business model of just doing SBIRs. The prototypes that they make do not transition into follow-on dollars, and these companies do not become product-based or growth stage companies. They're essentially research and development companies that endlessly do research and development and utilize SBIR as one of their main streams of revenue. 29 companies nationwide have been identified in capturing, I think the number is in the high 20s, 27, 28, 29% of the total bill for SBIR. SBIR is almost $4 billion a year. There's like 29 companies that capture like north of 20% of that, never transition their products, never get follow-on funding, and never become the companies that we need more of in America. Anyone that's on the Silicon Valley Defense Group NatSec 100, right? Like the Andurils, the Saronics, the Shield AIs, the companies that are raising hundreds of millions of dollars and actually making products, these are not them. And they're capturing massive amounts of SBIR dollars that are really going nowhere. I mean, there are reports out there that show that they convert their dollars invested in these companies convert 1-to-1 in follow-on funding or transition, whereas other companies, the companies that the program was intended for are converting at 20% or higher, or 20x on their dollars in follow-on funding and transition. These are the numbers we want to be seeing from America's seed fund, right? So that's an issue. And that's a predominant issue because it's really not doing what the program was intended to, and has created a cottage industry that is funneling money away from the purpose. I'm not going to go as far as calling it fraud, waste, and abuse, but others have. Issue. So the ranking member, which always just means the lead person in the minority party at the time, the ranking member of the Small Business Committee, is from Massachusetts. Behind California, Massachusetts as a state is the largest recipient of SBIR money. Now, that's not weird, right? If it was, I don't know, pick another state, it might be weird, but it's not. They have MIT there. They have a budding startup community. I mean, like, what's the flippant phrase, right? Austin, Boston, and the Valley, right? We know that. MIT's there, MITRE's there. All kinds of things go on. In Boston, lots of great companies come out of Boston and the general Massachusetts area, right? You know, Harvard, Kennedy School hosts a really great, national security conference every year. That's not the weird part or the problematic part. The problematic part is that the senator from the great state of does not want to lose that money. And maybe some of those companies are also located in Massachusetts. So the senator from the great state of Massachusetts, who is the ranking member on the Small Business Committee, does not want to reform the program. And the senator from the great state of Iowa, who is the chairwoman of the Small Business Committee, wants the money to go where it is effective. Senator Joni Ernst is famously known for saying, I can be a budget hawk and a defense hawk all at the same time. So where does that leave us? That leaves us at an impasse. The ranking member does not want to change the program, and the chairwoman does. And she very clearly outlined that in the Innovate Act with all the things she wants fixed. The other part of this problem is the SBIR, specifically in the early stages of it, the SBIR 1, a company's first SBIR 2, when they are still in Austin, Boston, and the Valley. They come from a tech background or a startup, or they're at some incubator or living on, some friend's couch outside Stanford, is not really taking their operational security seriously. And our adversaries have done a decent job at penetrating early on into these companies and either capturing IP or making investments to then which they have access to information later in the process, which is highly problematic because if we're trying to rapidly grow new defense tech, NatSec, war tech companies, and our adversaries know that if they want to penetrate them, you don't try to send a Chinese spy to go get a job at Lockheed Martin. You put them on a founding team somewhere in Palo Alto and keep them there for a long time, or invest, or somehow in some way, shape, or form get access to the IP and their development process so that you could steal it and bring it back to China. Big problem. That needs to get fixed. So it is officially, if you talk to anybody in the government, it's called FOCI, Foreign Ownership, Control, and Interest. That's the second part of the problem. From some recent discussions with people who are on said small business committees, they haven't even got to fighting that out yet. They're still fighting out the Cybermill issue. Cybermills, the companies that funnel the money into their business model without transitioning or becoming a real company. So until that is fixed, SBIR is dead. So you could say, well, why don't you just put it into the NDAA, right? NDAA authorizes lots of things. You go into the NDAA is like 7,000 pages long if you put the whole thing together. There's a lot of things in there that get passed into the NDAA that have no jurisdiction within the Department of Defense. I mean, they've tried to put the Farm Bill in NDAA and past. FAA reauth has gone in there. In years past, they've put the Intelligence Authorization Act in there. There's all kinds of shit in the NDAA that doesn't belong there. If you read it cover to cover, one, you're a psycho, but two, you'll see all kinds of stuff there that doesn't make sense. They have the jurisdiction to it with approval of the committee of jurisdiction for which they are putting the irrelevant information in there. They can put things in the NDAA. You would say, if this is so important to defense and defense startups, why wouldn't you put it in the NDAA? The answer is because Senator Joni Ernst is also on the Senate Armed Services Committee and also happens to be the chairwoman of the subcommittee on emerging threats and capabilities, which is where programs like SBIR would go. So, not going to happen in either one of those. There are some creative people in our government that are trying to figure out other ways to get SBIR reauthorized. It is going to be highly detrimental to the small business community who are doing all the right things, to the startup community that's leveraging SBIR to bring new technology to the department. There are amazing use cases of startups that were not a company 4 or 5 years ago that have done amazing things utilizing this program. It is highly detrimental to the IP protections of small businesses because with your first SBIR, I'm paraphrasing here, but the law says something to your IP extensions and logical conclusions are all protected under IP law because of the SBIR program specifically. And SBIR 1 leads to SBIR 2. The infamous SBIR 3 is really regular military service dollars, but SBIR Phase 3s are a sole source contract of which you don't need to recompete because SBIR is a competitive process. And by the time you get to Phase 3, you could be taking that ones and tens if you got an SBIR and then a StratFi level dollars and taking them into the tens and hundreds of millions of dollars through procurement activities or large scale contracts through, say, an O&M, if that's the case and it's applicable, through an SBIR Phase 3, which is a sole source determination and your contracting vehicle. Without that, there's a lot of people that are going to find it very hard to do business in the kind of big prime FAR-based contract way. And we're just seeing the beginning stages of the other transaction authorities really becoming law of the land. So yet again, another valley of death for which you to die in, which is where contracting authorities and how you get your determinations could become more difficult for a while. But we are seeing a lot of focus on utilizing other transaction authorities as the law of the land. So it's the same. No, it's not the same. It's similar, but not the same, because if you go through your contract types, the 40 series of other transaction authorities, they traditionally start with RDT&E activities and prototyping, and the RDT and prototyping activities of other transaction authorities are not synonymous with the RDT&E activities of SBIR. Yeah. So that's where we're at. SBIR is dead as of today. Negotiations are at this point not going well, and creative people are getting creative. There is guidance out on the street, was issued by the Department of Defense, Department of War, on SBIR. SBIR contracts currently underway from fiscal year 2024 and fiscal year 2025, RDT&E is 2-year money, can be executed and completed. SBIR Phase 3 transitions and contracting vehicles are still authorized because that is not SBIR dollars or dollars that are guided and directed under the jurisdiction of SBA authorities. That is just service dollars. So you can continue to cut SBIR 3 contracts at the service level, but no new FY 2026 SBIR dollars will be awarded, obligated, executed, or at this point, announcements or projects even announced. So we're going to keep an eye on that. As of right now, SBIR is dead. We all pray that we can come to an agreement that there is both an example of SBIR when it goes bad. There's an example of SBIR when it goes good, and we all want the good part to happen and less of the bad part to happen. But I think generally across the board, everyone would agree that SBIR is still a good tool and we want to resurrect it from the dead. So SBIR, stay tuned. All right. Other things that are happening at the Pentagon and in the Department of War. DFARS, the Defense Federal Acquisition Regulation. All right. As we talk about this is an important part of understanding how our government functions. When Congress passes a law, outside of like a big piece of legislation like the Forged or the Speed Act, it's usually like a paragraph, maybe a page. You cannot run an executive branch government on like a page of instructions. The process that happens after that is rulemaking. It happens through the federal regulatory process, and the FAR, the Federal Acquisition Regulation, which contains all the regulatory decisions of the executive branch on how they're going to implement the legislation that directs them from Congress. Yeah, follow that bouncing ball. Predominantly comes out in the FAR, and then the Department of War has their own because they are the government's biggest buyer of everything. They have a DFAR, a Defense FAR. I wonder if they're going to change that title to WFAR. So when things go into rulemaking and they're going through the federal regulatory process, they're announced on the Federal Register. Another place that you should be watching for things that are going to happen in the government that are going to be directing the Department of War on how to act, and you should know if those things are good for you or bad for you, so you should be checking the Federal Register. Something that just came out of the Federal Register and is now being implemented in the DFAR was a final rule that was published late August that deals with conflicts of interest for certain DoD contracts. This was written because certain consultants, other third-party contractors known as SETAs, Systems Engineering and Technical Assistance Firms, and other software integrators were advising DoD on requirements for the requirements and the details on how to meet warfighter and department need, and then bidding on those same contracts. So the final rule came out that outlines some new rules and directives on how conflict of interest will be mitigated. If you participate in any of those types of activities, whether that be software integration, systems engineering, or technical assistance, or you're thinking that that's a logical expansion for your business, if you're a large software provider of which other software or other hardware needs to integrate into it, you should read through this. It is DFAR's case 2004- D Delta 007 Delta 007. That should be pretty easy to remember. We will throw a link down below if you are in those activities. These are things that you need to know about. Additionally, FAR thresholds, Federal Acquisition Regulation thresholds for micro purchases and simplified acquisition threshold have been increased. They've increased the threshold for micro purchases and simplified acquisition. So micro purchase threshold is now $15,000, and simplified acquisition threshold is now $350,000. And in certain cases for contingency and humanitarian assistance, higher than that. So here we are talking about utilizing O&M, operations and maintenance dollars. Okay, so I don't want to diminish the importance or the seriousness of any government funds, but this is essentially the checking account for the Department of War. This is 1 year money that's used to buy the things that are normal or routine in nature. Think office supplies, think small dollar commercial purchases that wouldn't make any sense at all in the world of making them a large program of record. Like, when I was in special operations, like we all got like a commercial GPS, like it's a Garmin you could buy at Cabela's. You don't need a government program of record in, a 5-year development to make a GPS that you just go buy from, Bass Pro Shop. So like things like that. It's also used for training funds. It's also used for other logistics functions, things like that. So what? Why does that matter to you? Well, there are lots of things that you could be making that you could utilize simplified acquisition threshold and O&M dollars, operations and maintenance, which is very flexible and is pushed all the way down to some of the lowest levels in the military and under pretty loose guidance and jurisdiction to the users of these dollars. So here, let me paint you a very clear example. My old unit, the Marine Special Operations Command, MARSOC, has O&M dollars. The commander of MARSOC has supply officers and people who are trained in contracting for micro purchases and simplified acquisition. And he has the authority to use dollars, O&M dollars, within the jurisdiction and direction of how Congress appropriated those dollars. But once it goes into O&M, it's looser than anywhere else, right? Like procurement dollars are for explicit deliverables. This many of this widget. You don't see a lot of that in the O&M. It's more flexible. So if you carry your ass down to Camp Lejeune, North Carolina, bang on the gate at Stone Bay and say, hey, I have this really cool software I want to show you. And it really is really cool software and everybody wants it. And you're talking to, somebody up in the head shed and they're like, this is great. We would love to buy this. How much does it cost? If your answer is, oh, well, we'll sell you an enterprise license for $10 million, they're going to tell you to go pound sand because they don't have that kind of money at that level, nor do they really have the authority or jurisdiction to create a program of record at that level. If you were selling software to SOCOM, you carry your ass down to Tampa, Florida and go talk to the PEO for soft digital applications. MARSOC doesn't start a program of record, right? So you're like, okay, so then what? Well, if you were willing to sell a software license or a seat or a limited use case for a pilot, and the cost of that happens to be under $350,000, you could lock down a user in a small pilot that could be writing those user reviews and giving you your user feedback and now helping you, work through the requirements and give you feedback and good, bad, and different, while then you carry your ass a couple hours west in North Carolina to Fort Bragg, North Carolina, go bang on another fence over there at, 3rd Special Forces Group and go, hey, the guys over at MARSOC are using this. You want to buy a $350,000 license to try this out? It's like guerrilla marketing, guerrilla sales, ground up. Like that's what you're going to do that through O&M. If it's not applicable to your product and like your each is $1 million, okay, well, that doesn't play. But if you're looking at your portfolio of products and going, hey, I want to expand my user base and we could offer limited pilots to different organizations at $350,000 or less, the decision-making authority in that probably lies with the component level commander, which is probably like a 1-star, 2-star, right? There's lots of opportunity there at that point, and we usually don't talk about O&M dollars because they're not for recurring needs. They're not for things that are more durable in nature. You can get one or two things, but like those Garmins I was talking about, like when those are like beat up, like they just go in a dumpster, right? We're not sending them back to get them refurb. They're not part of a program of record. It's for consumable and generally, within the guidelines of fraud, waste, and abuse, disposable items. But in limited use cases, you can use simplified acquisition threshold to get a pilot program going to get in front of some users. And it's actually really, really helpful that they've increased it to $350,000. That's up $100,000. So I think it really opens the door for people who are just in a slightly higher price point. Now, that being said, unsolicited advice, if your thing's really $400,000 or $500,000 and you can take the loss, if the answer is getting it in front of a user for a loss or not getting it in front of that user, I think you probably work out those books internally and your investors might be a little bit happier that you're doing some stuff at cost or at a loss, but you're put it in front of users rather than not. Okay, this is a topic that we've addressed before. This gets spicy. This gets opinionated. People get real angry over this one, real emotional. There's a lot of passion in this, and I will touch it lightly. I really do want to bring in, some friends that work in the cyber world that really, really know this, but CMMC, the new law of the land, the law of the land, and now the updates to CMMC. Don't ask me what that acronym stands for. Look that one up. CMMC is the law of the land, and there have been some updates. In December of last year, a rule was passed that will now put new CMMC guidance, provision, rules, regulation will begin a phased in process on November 10th. So we're about 6 days away from the implementation of the first phase of new CMMC regulations. Make sure you know what they are, because if you are operating with the Department of War, there are going to be new boxes you need to check or new documentation that you're going to have to varying degrees, depending on what kind of work you're doing for cybersecurity. All right. Typically at this point, we hit contracts and awards. There are not a lot going on because the government shut down. Nothing really that's worth hitting at this point. There are some things going on. There are some smaller tech challenges and things that continue to be conducted and be awarded. Keep in mind, or realistically, I would say, in participating in these things and all the things, right? That you're not going to get a new CIBR opening until this is all fixed. But even with the award processes that are still going on, when you go there, ask the people what fiscal year dollars are going to fund this activity so that you can really do some internal expectation management. I know that the Army just completed an X-Tech challenge. Congratulations to all the winners. There's some really great companies in there. But my guess is that those are fiscal year 26 dollars. I don't know when we're going to see those, right? If the appropriations bills for defense were passed today, it takes typically 30 to 45 days to draw that money from the Treasury. It typically takes another 30 to 45 days to get it from the Treasury to the comptroller and then dispersed down to the awarding organizations. I mean, at any given time, you're looking 60 to 90 days from passage of the bill before the entity that awarded you that contract is going to be able to obligate those dollars. So, I mean, you can just, mentally just say from the date of enactment, 90 days at best to getting check cut. And that depends on how they're contracting. If you've got a standing contract, if you already have an OT, a CIBR Phase 3, an IDIQ that they can put the money on, if they have to go through a contracting action to get it done, it's going to be significantly delayed, just given the backlog of what we have going on with contracting right now. So there's just a lot going on. So if you are going out to these things, one, ask the question, what fiscal year dollars are going to be used to execute this? And then be the one to go back to whoever, is in your stakeholder group, whether that be, people in your C-suite, the rest of the people in your company, your investors, and say, hey, yeah, we won this, but their fiscal year $26. We are T plus 90 with no resolution to the appropriations bill in sight. They're sure as hell not going to get it done by the end of the current proposed CR, November 21st. Best case scenario, they get the bill across before the end of the calendar year. We've seen appropriations bills for the previous fiscal year go into Q2 of the fiscal or Q1 of the calendar, where we're still trying to appropriate bills in January, February, March. So you're T plus 90. Realistically, if you won an award today, you might not get a check until August. So just do some expectation management, continue to compete for everything, win everything, crush it, get out there, make your mark, drop your press release, tell everyone you won. But internally, just be very real. You're probably not getting that award cut until like August at best. Tests and demos, again, very, very halted or delayed just due to government shutdown. A lot of time, tests and demos are run through RDT&E dollars. Current unobligated 24 and 25 RDT&E dollars are continually being earmarked to pay the troops, depending on how long the government shutdown goes. So those are always at risk. If you don't actually have those dollars obligated or executed, they're at risk for being scooped up for other activities. But then additionally, there are no fiscal year $26 yet with no CR. They can't even spend it last year's numbers. So I think everybody's hesitant to run any events right now. If you're looking for events, tests, experimentations, large-scale training exercises, you should be tracking on a normal business week. You should be tracking the Undersecretary of War for Research and Engineering has an events page, and Vulcan, the system that is set up by SOCOM, has a very robust events, exercises, training, demo event calendar. Right now, they're mostly blank. So that's the indicator that we don't have a CR. They're not going to use RDT&E dollars. They can't use RDT&E dollars to project spending yet. $24 and $25 are probably going to get scooped up for other stuff. And then you get into the O&M side, where large-scale military exercises and training events are typically run through O&M. And again, O&M dollars expire at the end of the year. There is no previous year O&M that can be tapped when the fiscal year closes. Those dollars are gone. They go back to the Treasury. This is where you get the use it or lose it activities and behaviors in the DoD. The O&M dollars go away. There is no tapping them in the following year. It's 1 year money. That's also how they spend money for training. So there's also none of that. So training, testing, demos, experimentations, not a lot going there. But as soon as they do, you need to be getting on that train. Some of the big ones that we're always watching and looking at is anything run out of the Undersecretary of War for Research and Engineering, specifically the T-Rex series that is scheduled to go in March at Camp Atterbury in Indiana. They are very much still conducting planning conferences for that. It's a large event. The Undersecretary himself has been known to participate in that event and come out and do the VIP day. That is still very much underway. So as soon as the government opens up, if you're not already participating in the planning conferences for some of these bigger exercises that are going to happen, Q2, Q3 of the calendar year, that should be one of your first order of businesses, because there's no better way to get user support than to get that stuff in their hands while they're running around the jungle or the desert actually getting to use that shit. This is usually a section for opportunities. It's just rough out there right now. I'd say it's like the Hunger Games, but it's not really. It's like Mad Max. Like as far as the eye can see, there is no oil. And where there is, the very few places that there is stuff going on, everybody's fighting over it. It's a very Mad Max kind of world at the moment. We'll see what happens as soon as opportunities start opening up when the government finally reopens. Bottom line, all you can do right now is prep, plan, prepare, write white papers, write quads, write con-ops, write briefs, be prepared for the opening because, like we just mentioned with O&M dollars, those have to be spent by the end of the fiscal year. If we go 2 quarters, if appropriations don't get passed until January, February, March next year, you've got 2 quarters of unused O&M dollars that are going to have to go somewhere. Be ready. Be ready to sprint as soon as this shit opens back up. Give me a sec here. Add something back in here. Da, 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 da. Bop, bop, pop, bop. Boop. All right. And we're going to roll up. We're going to roll up here with more kind of issue service specific, what's going on in the world, where are your opportunities when the night fades and the sun comes back up and the departments open again and we can get back to saving the world. So first, Replicator, you don't know about this, you can look it up. We'll put some links. Replicator was an initiative that was started under the last administration under Deputy Secretary Kathleen Hicks. And the idea was buy hundreds of thousands of drones to get to Indo-PACOM so that robots can fight the war for us. Yay. Love the idea. In execution, it has failed to meet mission and has subsequently been put under the authority of someone other than the DepSec and someone other than DIU, who Deputy Secretary Hicks utilized for the Replicator initiative. It is now under the jurisdiction of the Vice Commander of United States Special Operations Command, one General Donovan, and he is now directing the activities of the DAWG, the Defense Autonomous Working Group. So that is obviously a short-term initiative to get a few key programs across the finish line at scale. But if you are working in that space or you have replicator type initiatives and you are not aware of this, you need to be, and you need to phone a friend because that's where the replicator initiatives will be executed and generally wrapped up and closed up as soon as possible because General Donovan's actually got a day job, which is being the Vice Commander of SOCOM. Additionally, Counter UAS, Golden Dome, all has a huge focus right now. They have set up the task force for Counter UAS. And that is moving out under the jurisdiction of the Counter Unmanned Systems, the Counter UAS Task Force, as well as some senior officials up at the Undersecretary of War for Research and Engineering that come out of the Mission Capabilities Office. So Replicator and Golden Dome Counter UAS are being handled by the highest level authorities. They are focused on speed, delivery, and if you think you are part of these and you are hearing a lot of this for the first time, phone a friend because this thing's moving really fast. They are looking to execute in a breakneck timeline. And if you want to be involved, you need to move fast. Just going to leave it at that. We can dig deep dive more into those as more information is provided. Okay. Navy, Marine Corps, AUKUS. Okay. So the last thing I'm going to hit is the last bit of uncertainty that is of great or grave interest to our startup community, which is the current state of the Defense Innovation Unit. So, as it stands today, the Undersecretary for War for Research and Engineering, actual Mr. Emil Michael, is currently the director of DIU. DIU is statutorily, in law, a direct report to the Secretary of Defense. That was created under the past administration when Mr. Doug Beck was the director of DIU for the purposes of giving it autonomy and sovereignty outside the research and engineering enterprise, where there was concern that it was deprioritized or to a certain degree at odds with the research and engineering community, because if we have an entire branch of the Department of Defense that does RDT&E, aka like the Manhattan Project, why would they want to just go buy things commercially? Right? There's a cultural schism there there's a cultural conflict between the two, where the RDT&E community wants to develop things inside the department the way that they want it, with their, lab system at AFRL, ARL, the Navy lab system, the naval surface warfare, the naval warfare centers. Why would they want to just let a bunch of yahoos from, Silicon Valley and Austin build shit for defense? There's just a cultural difference there. And the concern was DIU is being deprioritized within a community that did not like, respect, or was in competition with. So it got moved out to be a direct report to the Secretary of Defense for essentially commercial purchasing and engagement with the commercial industry and how to bring venture-backed tech into defense faster. Okay, so Mr. Emil Michael came to the Department of War from a very, very senior position in LIFT. So he's currently the director of DIU as well. That's a lot of hats to be an undersecretary in charge of the entire RDT&E enterprise, as well as the director of DIU. So he has tapped his assistant secretary for critical technologies, Mr. Mike Dodd, to be the deputy director of DIU. But again, Mr. Mike Dodd is the assistant secretary for critical technologies, who has a whole job description of what he's supposed to be doing there. As the deputy, you would assume that the deputy director is the day-to-day director of ops for DIU. And again, it's a person who has two jobs, which begs the question of, when are we going to get an actual DIU director? Who is that person going to be? And when are they going to start operating at the speed, pace, and level that they did before Mr. Doug Beck departed his position? I don't know, but it's a good concern. And people should be asking that question, because the fact of the matter is two appropriations bills back, in the House Appropriations Defense Subcommittee bill, there was a work of art, a masterpiece, if you will, authored by a great American named Nate Diller for the purposes of submission to Chairman Calvert, the chairman of the Defense Appropriations Committee, who is also a lifelong dedicated national security professional, called The Hedge. And the Hedge strategy talks through exactly what Replicator was going to do, exactly what Hellscape is supposed to do, exactly what Navy RAS, Robotics and Autonomous Systems, is seeking to do right now, exactly what Army Transformation and Contact and the new structure of TRADOC and Army Futures Command being together to speed commercial capabilities, to put marketplaces together so we can get capability in the hands of the warfighter in the combatant commands faster, because they're the ones who need to fight the war and shouldn't be held up in some bureaucratic nightmare in DC. All the words are in that bill. There's also $1 billion for DIU to do that in the bill. Additionally, DIU got another. That was weird. DIU has $1 billion in the defense appropriations bill to do hellscape things. They also have an additional $2 billion in reconciliation, big beautiful bill. We have an organization that went from $100 million organization to a $3 billion organization, very specifically to do exactly what everyone has been saying, whether it was in the Hedge strategy, whether it was in Replicator, whether it was in Hellscape. The money is there to do this, to move cheap, autonomous, robotic, AI terminators into Indo-PACOM so that the CCP doesn't fuck around and find out, and no one is actively in charge of this organization that doesn't have a day job. This is one of my greatest concerns right now. SBIR, bad. Government shutdown, bad. The fact that we have an organization that's got $3 billion on deck without a director and has really apparently, at least to the outside world, hit the brakes on the activities that were underway prior to the previous director's departure is a huge concern, and one that we will absolutely be keeping our eyes on. I look forward to future episodes where I can announce a new DIU director and all of their plans to engage the ever-growing and amazing American commercial and private enterprise that wants to participate in our national security and all the ways that they're going to do that. Right now, I got nothing for you. If any of these things are warranting a deep dive, if any of these would be beneficial to anybody out there, just let us know. Put it in the comments, send an email, however you get in touch with me, social, LinkedIn, whatever. Say, hey, I need to know more about this. That's fine. Happy to do it. That's what we're here for. Beyond that, keep learning. The more you know, the more you can sell, the more you can engage in our nation's national security. This isn't a job. This isn't an endeavor. This isn't a mission for part-timers or part-timers, grifters, whatever the stupid word is. You have to learn, and you have to know this shit, and you have to be dedicated to selling to one of the most difficult customers in the entire world, because you're doing it for the right reasons, right? You're doing it for the warfighter that knows that there's better out there, and they should, if we're going to ask the sons and daughters of America to sign on the dotted line and offer to risk their lives for our country and our safety, they should at least have the best shit that we could give them. So it's a noble cause, but you can't do it as a part-time job or haphazardly. You have to learn. You have to constantly be reading and educating. And that's how you get more traction. That's how you sell more. That's how you get more customers. That's how you continue to grow. And that's the fuel that allows you to do the thing, whatever that is, that drove you to become part of this ecosystem to begin with. So if you want to know more, there's always ways to engage more. You should, I'll give you three of them that you're going to get very familiar with, but join the Frontier House, nonprofit here in Washington, D.C. It's a base of operations. It's a support system. If you come to D.C. once a year, come once a quarter. If you come once a quarter, come once a month. Be in D.C. more. Engage with all the people that we're talking about here, your congressional staff, the people who work at the Pentagon, the people who work in your program offices. There's a community of support here. It's nonprofit. It's a base of operations, and it gives you the opportunity to be in DC more because, spoiler alert, Boeing, Raytheon, and Lockheed are here every single day. Second, well, let's just leave it at that for now. There are other ways to engage. We'll save those for another time. We'll roll them out when they're ready. Besides that, if you have listened this far, thank you very much. You are either truly dedicated to the mission, a psychopath. No, I'm not going to say that. Well, if you've made it this far in the event, thank you for listening. You are either truly dedicated, or I'm probably just on in the background somewhere. But anyways, hope it was beneficial. If you want to deep dive on anything or follow up on anything, hit me up, comments, chats, LinkedIn, however you get a hold of me. Do the things, like, subscribe. The more you do that, the more I can do this.